Chapter 12. Return to Rowandale by Robin Hektus. It all started with the ringing of a doorbell. A quite extraordinary doorbell, as it happens. I'd never heard anything quite like it. As I waited there on the spotless marble doorstep, it chimed a rousing segment from Albaren's Third Symphony. I was rather astonished. There must have been some kind of very clever clockwork mechanism inside the door. After quite some time there was a rattle within, the encouraging sound of a turning key, and a violent juddering, as though someone were trying to open the door. Then all became silent, and I was left wondering whether I would ever gain access to the inn before nightfall. The sign above me groaned wearily in the winter wind. I pulled the doorbell again, and another extract from Albaren's masterpiece drifted through the crisp cold air. I waited, and eventually the door swung open with a piercing creak. I looked inside, and there in front of me was the most dazzling sight my eyes have ever beheld. I don't quite know how to put it into words. I was well and truly, totally and utterly, completely and entirely bowled over by what I saw as I stared into the hallway. Even now, as I recall that moment, my heart melts helplessly within me. For there before me, mesmerizing and hypnotizing in the extreme, stood the most impossibly beautiful girl this world has ever seen. Never before and never since have I encountered such astonishing and overwhelming beauty. "Good afternoon," she said, the sweetest, most enchanting voice you could ever imagine. "Good afternoon," I returned, surprised and rather relieved that I could get any words out of my mouth. "You must be Hektus," she said. "Come on in. My name's Amarella." Amarella. What a melodious, magical name, I thought. I stepped inside. The hallway was sumptuously decorated and clearly designed to impress, but it didn't impress me in the slightest. How could it, when in front of me was the most astoundingly radiant creature in all Ganvor? I was utterly captivated. I desperately hoped that I wouldn't say anything ridiculous. "Sorry about the wait," she said, smiling the most deliciously warm and intoxicating smile that I've ever witnessed in all my days. "We don't open for another hour, and the door was jammed. I'll tell Mr. McFiby you've arrived." "Thank you," I replied, unable to think of anything more imaginative to say. She went through a door at the back of the hallway and disappeared from sight. The room went dark. The truth was inescapable. I, Robin Hektus, was comprehensively spellbound. My heart was prisoner to the loveliest young woman ever to have walked upon this world. I knew in that moment that there was only one thing I wanted in all the universe. I wanted to marry Amarella. Well, that was how it began, 3 years ago, almost to the day. And the more I got to know her, the more certain I became. She was even more exquisitely wonderful than I could ever have dreamed. And it was far more than just an outward attraction. It's true that she is the most breathtakingly stunning girl ever to draw breath, but Uncle Glester's always telling me that beauty's fleeting and charm is a snare. But there is an inner loveliness, a sweetness, a delightfulness to Amarella that seems to shine out of her in all that she says and all that she does. I find her absolutely enthralling in every conceivable way. She's a pure marvel through and through. I love her with all my heart. This is the story of how I finally plucked up the courage to pose the question I'd been longing to ask her ever since I first met her on that cold winter's day. I had just returned from the most gruelling and frightening adventure of my entire life. I had fought against Grochukans. I had been cast into Grucengolga. I had passed through a tunnel filled with Crendorn bats. I had been chased by a swarm of ferocious giant wasps. But now I faced the scariest ordeal of all. I had to look Amarella in the eyes, maintain full courage and composure, and stammer out those words I had yearned to utter for so long. "Amarella, will you marry me?" On the 9th day of Ranvin, I crossed the border of Galamenia with 5 weary companions after a long and exhausting journey. We had come all the way from Grucengolga, through forest, mountain, desert and sea, and I can't express how good it felt to see a bright and cheerful sign telling us we were now in the domain of Queen Hivernia III. "Ah, you can feel it in the air, can't you?" Mr. Algothian the farmer cheered. "The soft, gentle breeze of Galamenia."
"I'm not aware that the air has altered in any especially discernible manner,"
Mr. Slank, a regular at the inn, replied.
"Of course it has, Slank,"
our leader, General Montagolin, said.
"We're breathing in the sweet, clean, wholesome air of our own native land now. You really can't beat it, Slank. We're home at last."
That day had been a particularly horrible one, if truth be told. We'd lost one of our group in a rather dreadful and terrible way. Mr. Tando, a blacksmith from Willowdale, had been stabbed by our enemy Mr. Rhombus. He's a hideous man, that Mr. Rhombus. He'd been trying to kill the Queen, but Mr. Tando did something ever so brave. He was up on a balcony with Mr. Ramkhan, the Baromian, and they could see everything that was happening in the room below them. At just the right time, Mr. Tando smashed through one of the windows and dived down onto Mr. Rhombus, who was wielding a knife, and got himself killed in the process. Some people thought Mr. Tando was nothing but a coward, but it turned out he was very, very brave indeed. He saved the Queen's life. I shall never forget his act of valour. It's so sad that he's gone. Later that day, the Queen had summoned the 6 of us into a heavily guarded chamber, where she lay recovering on an enormous 4-poster bed draped with golden curtains. The General was absolutely beside himself with shame that he had allowed Mr. Rhombus to get so close to the Queen and nearly take her life. He tried as best as he could to explain the situation, and how he had no idea the Queen's life would be in danger.
"There is only one way to redeem yourself, Hercules,"
the Queen said, looking at him rather sternly.
"Yes, Your Majesty,"
the General replied.
"Anything, Your Majesty. I would go to the outermost reaches of Ganvor and beyond if you commanded it, Your Majesty."
"You must track down that despicable reptile you brought into my presence, and bring him back to me alive in Barrack-Dean," she said. "He may prove very useful in discovering more of the enemy's plans, and in any negotiations that may take place once this war is over and done."
"Indeed, Your Majesty, indeed,"
the General agreed.
"But we have spent many hours looking for him, and thus far our search has been in vain."
"News has come to me from one of my sentries," the Queen reported. "Your Barracus was spotted crossing the border into Galamenia in the late afternoon."
"Then rest assured I shall hunt him down and apprehend him," the General promised. "I can never forgive myself for the foolish and disgraceful way in which I have conducted myself this day. I shall most certainly make amends. I shall seize that vile villain if it's the last thing I ever do in this failing mortal old body of mine."
So that was to be our final quest. We were given horses and weapons from the Royal Guard, and rode off into the hills. None of us could work out why Mr. Rhombus should have headed into Galamenia, but I was rather glad of it myself. It meant we were pressing ever nearer to Rowandale, the Silver Centaur, and my lovely Amarella. And after 2 or 3 hours of charging along at quite a pace, we saw that wonderful welcoming sign announcing our arrival in the beautiful land of our birth. My heart leapt for joy within me. It felt so good to be home. We camped for the night just a few yards from the border by the famous Rosian Falls, and set off again at first light. We kept a southerly course, and found ourselves trotting through the tranquil woods of the northern dales, and rejoiced in the familiar sight of ashes and beeches, the most quintessentially Galamine trees of them all. My thoughts, of course, were occupied with Amarella, and the tantalizing prospect of seeing her again after so many months of wretched separation. I imagined, in my mind's eye, riding up to the door of the Silver Centaur, a hero of war returned from an epic adventure, and seeing her step out from the hallway, golden hair shimmering in the sunlight, her face aglow with a warm welcoming smile, and her eyes meeting mine with an unspoken understanding that we would be each other's forever. Reality, however, could be very different indeed, I thought. I didn't know if she even liked me at all or not. Oh, what would her answer be? Would she laugh in incredulity that I'd actually believed I stood a chance of winning her hand? Surely not. Would she look on me with sympathy? Devastating, heart-shattering sympathy, pitying the foolish buffoon who had made such an idiot of himself by asking such a question? Or would a beaming, brilliant smile break out on her face as she flung her arms around me and whispered in my ear the one word of glorious affirmation I longed to hear above all others? There was only one way to find out. No more dithering, no more delaying. I would have to come out with it straight away as soon as I returned. That was what I firmly resolved as I rode along through those quiet, gentle valleys. "Do you see that, brothers?" Mr. Argothian called out in his hearty voice. The first flakes of snow. Beautiful, Mr. Jaggles, a very intelligent professor, exclaimed. Just in time for the winter feast. Does rather add something to the occasion, don't you think? My mind flew back to the first winter feast I'd spent in Rowandale, just days after my first encounter with Amarella. Snow had fallen thick and deep, and the lake on the edge of the village had frozen over completely. I can picture Amarella now, wrapped up in her long lilac scarf, hair blowing around in the icy winter wind, skating joyfully over the lake, laughing most deliciously as she whirled around with Rowena the cook. How I wished that I could have been there with her, hand in hand, joining in the merriment. But my incurable bashfulness, coupled with a rather clumsy disposition, meant that I was confined to the centaur kitchen, gazing out forlornly through the frosty window at the adorable and beguiling creature who had so thoroughly stolen my heart. The rest of the day was rather magnificent. The inn was packed out with more than half the village, so it seemed, assembled for the grandest and most mouth-watering banquet I had ever seen in my life. Pheasants and mallards, partridges and geese weighed down an enormous table of gigantic proportions, and hefty silver plates were piled high with potatoes and sausages, pies and pastries, salads and fruits, chestnuts and almonds. The low point of the day was spilling a jug of cranberry sauce all over Mrs. Melderelda's sparkling new dress. She really did make quite a spectacular fuss over the issue, and Mr. McFiber had more than a few stern words to say to me afterwards. But the highlight of the occasion was sitting down, once everyone had been served, on one of the few remaining chairs in the room, and finding myself next to the love of my life, and talking to her for almost the whole duration of the feast. Well, it's fair to say that she did rather a lot more of the talking than I did, for I find it very hard to string together more than a dozen meaningful words when I'm immersed in her presence. But she's never been the sort of girl who's lost for words, so it didn't really matter, and I enjoyed every second of it. Her voice was like magical, mellifluous music to my ears, and I felt as though with every word and every look and every smile she was drawing my heart ever deeper and more helplessly under her spell. Then came the singing and the dancing and the games and the storytelling. No, of course I didn't dance with her. That would have been far too bold and forthright a move for a shy young blunderer like me. "Stop daydreaming, boy," Mr. McFiber called, patting me on the shoulder. I stirred from my memories and realised that we had come to a halt. Everyone else had dismounted from their horses, and they were all sitting down in a circle, opening their bags and rummaging around for what remained of the food. I hastily joined them. "Never mind," Mr. Algothian said, examining the paltry offering set before us. "Once we've caught that old villain, we can enjoy a good long break at home and dine like kings."
"All being well, we should make it in time for the feast," the General said. "I assume you'll be doing your usual, McFiber. No one does a feast better than you."
"Well, I haven't exactly had time to prepare, have I?" Mr. McFiber answered. "It may be a little more meagre than usual, I fear. Mind you, I'm sure Amarella and Rowena will be getting something together. They'll be mighty surprised when we come charging through the door, eh?" "I may be able to help you out there, brother," Mr. Algothian said. "Perhaps I could offer a mallard or two from my farm."
"A mallard!" Mr. Jaggles exclaimed, licking his lips. "I haven't had one of those in a very long time. They don't go in for the feast so much in Baltham."
"Well, I'm sure you can join us at the Centaur this year," Mr. McFiber said. "There'll be plenty of room with half the village gone off to war."
"We've other business to attend to first, though," the General said. "We've got to catch that serpent Barracus."
"What's the plan, sir?" Mr. Slank asked. "He could be anywhere by now."
"He'll head for the nearest village, I'd imagine," the General replied. "He'll need to get provisions and a change of clothes to make himself less recognisable. After all, there'll be scores of the Queen's men patrolling these dales by now. We should be just a few miles from Cherrygate, by my reckoning. We'll make inquiries there."
"You can lodge for the night at my farm," Mr. Algothian offered. "Warm beds and soft blankets all round."
"We'd best press on, then," the General said. "Let's try to reach it by nightfall."
I grabbed a handful of morsels from the small heap in front of us and climbed back onto my faithful steed. As we trudged on through the deepening snow, my thoughts returned to the girl of my dreams and the delightful possibility that I would almost certainly see her very, very soon. But the time seemed to pass ever so slowly, and I began to feel extremely sleepy. I did nod off a couple of times, if I'm perfectly honest,
but then at last I heard a very merry and excited cry from Mr. Algovian. "We're here!" he cheered. "We've made it! Home at last! There it is, brothers! Good old Cherrygate trees, and good old Cherrygate grass, and good old Cherrygate flowers. And do you see that smoke rising up there over that hill? Do you know where that's coming from, brothers? The Phoenix Homestead, that's where it's coming from. Oh, it makes me want to dance, it does. It makes me want to punch the air for joy."
"Yes, well, first things first,"
the General said, rather dampening the moment.
"We need to make inquiries, see if we can locate Mr. Barracus. Let's each take one of the shops on the main street and start from there, shall we? See if anyone's spotted him. And if we don't pick up any trace of him here, we'll move on to the next village."
Cherrygate proved to be a rather charming little village, really. I'd never actually visited it before. The streets were lined with pretty little red brick buildings, and there seemed to be bright and cheery flowers everywhere, in the windows, round the doors, at the street corners, on the signposts. It was beautiful. The first shop I went in was an old antique shop, run by two elderly twins called Termo and Burmo, but they hadn't seen anyone matching Barracus's description, or indeed anyone new in the village at all. Next, I tried a bakery, but the lady in there didn't have any useful information either, though she did give me a couple of delicious iced buns at no charge at all. And then I entered a lovely-looking restaurant called the Unicorn and Bear. Inside, there was an old man with a bushy white beard wiping down the tables. "Good evening," I said. "I wonder if I could ask you one or two questions."
"Come in, my boy, come in," the man said. "Why don't you take a seat, my boy, and perhaps I can tempt you with a bite or two."
"No, thank you, sir," I replied. "I've just got a couple of questions I'd like to ask."
"Not even a mug of hot chocolate?" the man said. "It's a cold night out there. It'll warm you up a treat, I can tell you."
"Well, that does sound rather scrumptious," I admitted. "I can't remember the last time I had some hot chocolate. Go on then, just a small one."
"You won't regret it,"
the old man smiled, walking over to the bar.
"Dark or white?"
"Dark, please," I replied, sitting down at one of the tables. "We're looking for somebody, actually, a very dangerous Grochukan. He'd be in his early 30s, a couple of inches short of 6 foot, slim with dark brown hair. You haven't seen anyone like that, have you?" The old man paused for a moment thoughtfully, and then shook his head.
"Can't say that I have, my boy," he told me. "Can't say that I have. But let's get you this chocolate, shall we?"
He picked up a mug from behind the bar and disappeared into the kitchen.
"You wouldn't like a nice bacon sandwich to go with it, would you?"
he shouted back. "No, thank you," I answered. "Just the hot chocolate, please." As I sat there, waiting for the old man to return, I thought I could hear a noise coming from behind the bar, and there followed 3 loud bangs. I walked over to the bar to investigate, and the old man popped his head out from the kitchen.
"You all right there, my boy?"
he inquired. "I thought I heard something," I said, "under here."
"That'll be old Quebbins," the man said. "Co-owner of this fine establishment. He's doing a bit of repair work down in the cellar. You sit yourself down, my boy. Sit yourself down. Any marshmallows, I wonder?"
"Oh, yes, please," I said. "Fantastic." I returned to my seat, and the old man hurried back into the kitchen. He had been gone for a good few minutes when I heard it again, a definite banging noise coming from behind the bar. I looked over to the kitchen door. There was no sign of the old man. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly rose up from my seat, crept over to the bar, hauled my upper body over it, and peered underneath. What I saw sent a cold shiver of terror right down my spine. Tied up on the dusty floor with an old gnarled rope and a gag over his mouth was a short, stout gentleman in a bright orange waistcoat, kicking the bar with his feet. I looked up and saw to my horror that the old man had returned, carrying a large mug of piping hot chocolate in his right hand and a long rolling pin in the other. Our eyes met, and I stared into his, fear-struck for what seemed like an age, though in reality it must only have been a second or two. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind as to who it was there in front of me. The old man was Barracus. A dozen disturbing images flashed through my brain. Mr. Ramkhan covered in scars, Mr. Volko with a shell in his stomach, Mr. Tando lying dead on the floor. And there before me was the man responsible for it all, the man who had tricked us all, the man who wanted to torture us,
the man who had nearly killed the Queen. What was I to do? Should I run for my life? Should I cry out for help? Should I fight him? What chance had I got, a ham-fisted waiter against this deadly and highly trained killer? On the plus side, all he had was a kitchen utensil and a scorching hot beverage. I wondered why he hadn't picked a meat fork or a carving knife. Perhaps the rolling pin was the closest thing to hand when he heard me coming to the bar. Anyway, I was better armed than he was, since I still had the sword that the Queen had given me. But on the miner's side, he had experience, expertise, courage, cunning, and a natural viciousness, none of which could particularly be attributed to me. But what other option did I have? I was a soldier in Her Majesty's army. I couldn't let him get away. Even if it cost me my life, I knew I had to at least have a go. I reached for my sword and lashed it out towards him. "Good try, Hektus," he said with a smirk as he dodged my blow. "You'll have to do better than that, though." He hurled the rolling pin straight at my face, giving me a nasty knock on the temple, and retreated back into the kitchen, presumably in search of a better weapon. I leapt over the bar and quickly cut the bonds of poor Mr. Quebbins, who was still lying there on the floor. Barracus re-emerged with a menacing grin and a rather nasty-looking meat cleaver, and he lunged at me ferociously, almost knocking the sword out of my hand as I thrust it forward in defence. There followed a terrifying few minutes of frenetic combat as Barracus chased me round the room, relentlessly swiping at me with his deadly implement, while I tried to keep him at bay as best I could with a wild waving of the sword. He slashed off a corner of my jacket at one point, and the next moment he had me pinned against the bar, though I managed to summon up enough strength from somewhere to kick him forcefully away with both feet. "You've got spirit, boy, I'll give you that," Barracus laughed. "Lay down your sword and you won't get hurt, my friend." I shot into the kitchen and cast my eyes around to see if there was anything I might use in my defence. I picked up a metal platter to shield myself from his lunges, and hurled a couple of plates at him as he bounded into the room. Undeterred, he charged at me with his cleaver and hammered down a mighty blow, buckling my platter quite severely. "Time to give up, my friend," he urged me. "Full marks for pluck, my boy, but I really don't want to kill you. Think of your poor Amarella." At the mention of her name, a strange kind of fury came over me, and I thrashed at him so fiercely with my sword that he actually edged back a few paces. My eye fell upon an iron pot on the table beside me, so I seized hold of it, threw it at Barracus with great force, and dashed back out into the kitchen. He was soon storming after me again with a fearsome, raging look in his eyes. I think it was the first time I had ever witnessed him losing his cool. I pounced up onto the bar and tried to use the added height to my advantage, but he soon had me toppling backwards onto the floor, and the sword fell from my grip. I thought I was done for. It was all over. Surely nothing could save me now. "Farewell, Mr. Hektus," came the voice of my foe, and I braced myself for a final blow. As he came round the side of the bar, however, I saw him suddenly falter. Losing his balance, he collided violently with a fully stocked wine rack, and the whole thing came crashing down on top of him, so that within a matter of seconds he was completely buried in an avalanche of bottles. It seemed that Mr. Quebbins had caught him unawares and tripped him up, so that my villainous adversary now lay within my grasp. I struggled up from the ground, took up my sword, kicked away some of the bottles, and pointed my blade towards his throat, so that when at that very moment the General and Mr. McFiber burst into the room, I must have looked rather heroic.
"Is that who I think it is?"
the General said in astonishment. "One Barracus of Kendham," I confirmed with a smile. "I didn't catch him all by myself, mind. Mr. Quebbins here lent a hand, or a foot at least."
Well, 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 bravo, Hektus," the General cheered. "I didn't think you had it in you."
"He's a fine boy, if truth be told," Mr. McFiber said. "Beneath that bumbling exterior there's a heart of real valour." Mr. Barracus was duly tied up and chained, and it really was so wonderfully satisfying to see the man who'd caused us so much trouble finally bound and captive. "Well, well," he said, as he looked round at us all with a beaming smile. "Credit where credit's due, I say. You've caught me fair and square, haven't you? Not many can claim that, I can tell you. Now I dare say you have one or two grievances against your old friend Rhombus. I quite understand, my friends. I don't blame you. But war's war, isn't it?
You've got to do what it takes, haven't you? I've simply been doing my job, gentlemen. Serving my emperor."
The general looked at Barracus and grunted.
"You're looking for clemency, are you?"
he said with a hint of a growl.
"Don't want us to come down too hard on you. You'll get everything that's coming to you, Mr. Barracus, so you might as well wipe that smile off your face and stop calling us your friends."
"I'm sure we can come to some kind of arrangement," our enemy continued, unperturbed. "Perhaps we could organise a prisoner exchange. Hand me back to my side in return for one of your men. Mr. Gevins, perhaps, or one of your comrades in Golga."
"We're not going to bargain with you, Barracus,"
the general sighed.
"You'll go to the royal dungeons. We're not letting you on the loose again."
"Have a think about it anyway," Barracus persisted, still grinning away. "You've got to be pragmatic in situations like this, General. You mustn't let your feelings get in the way of good policy. I know you've got a few things against me, I quite understand, but you could get some of your own men back, General. That's got to be worth it, hasn't it?"
"I'll put a gag on you if you don't give that forked tongue of yours a rest," the general snapped. "Our orders are quite clear. We're to send you to the Queen. Try pleading with her if you like, but it won't get you anywhere. Your days of villainy are over."
As it was beginning to get dark, it was decided not to head for Barrack-Dean until morning. Instead, we would stay the night at Mr. Algothian's cottage, taking it in turns to guard our prisoner. What a fascinating place his home turned out to be. Beyond a tall yellow gate lay a long straight path with all manner of assorted creatures on either side. We passed a stately stag, still as a statue, gazing out into the distance, a romp of otters playing in a stream, and a trio of small gibbons swinging from a tree. There was a spectacular four-winged bird with golden feathers perched on a large log, and a strange horned creature with 10 legs that kept on changing colour. A number of lizards and tortoises crossed in front of us as we pressed on forwards, and then, most alarmingly, we saw a small grey bear stretched out by a pool of water in a large high-walled enclosure. And all the while, as we proceeded, Mr. Algothian kept on calling out greetings in all directions. "Hello, Silverhoof. You all right there, Ginger? Good to see you again, Milksy." At length we came to his cottage, a quaint red brick building with roses round the front door and a tall chimney smoking away on the roof. Mr. Algothian dismounted and pulled a scarlet cord that hung from the porch, but the ring of the bell that followed was soon drowned out by noisy barking. As the door swung open, about 5 or 6 dogs came leaping out, knocking Algothian flat onto the ground as they did so. "Charcoal, chocolate, chestnut, Sandy, Snowflake. Did you miss me, did you?" he laughed as he affectionately rubbed each dog in turn. Then he looked up, and there in the doorway was his rosy-cheeked, jolly-looking wife, dressed in an apron and holding a long flower-covered rolling pin. Her mouth was agape at the sight of her husband, unexpectedly lying there right in front of her on the grass. He sprang up, flung out his arms, and seized hold of her with the warmest, tightest, longest, and most affectionate of embraces. "My darling Karina," he announced proudly as he turned round and looked back at the rest of us. "Welcome to Phoenix Cottage."
"Can it really be you, my dear?"
Mrs. Karina said, with joy stamped all over her face.
"How have you got back here? The war isn't over, is it? Who are all your friends? What has happened, my dear? Oh, it's so good to see you."
"You'd best all come in," Mr. Algothian said, beckoning us over the threshold. "Just in time for supper, are we? Food first, explanations after, I reckon." We all heartily agreed and followed him inside to the cheery glow and welcoming warmth of the cottage. And it seemed that there were almost as many animals within as there had been outside. There was a great multicoloured bird on a stand in the hall, a large badger curled up in an armchair in the living room, and 6 kittens running about in the kitchen where Algothian now led us. He hastily removed a hedgehog from one of the wooden chairs that were set around the kitchen table and invited us all to sit down.
"What a charming place you've got here,"
the general said, glancing around the room in admiration. "You know who this is, don't you, Karina?" Mr. Algothian beamed. "None other than Lord Montagolin himself.
He's been our leader, and that there is his butler, Mr. Slank."
"How do you do?"
Mr. Slank said politely, raising his hat. "And these here are Sergeant McFiber and Mr. Hektus from the Silver Centaur in Rowandale," Mr. Algothian continued. "And the gentleman in the corner there is the learned Professor Jaggles from the University of Baltham." "And I'm Merlin Rhombus," Mr. Barracus added, with a cheery smile. "Pleasure to meet you."
"You hold your tongue," the General growled. "I'm afraid this is a Grochucan prisoner. I'm sorry to have to sully your house with his presence."
"Don't you worry, my darling," Mr. Algothian said to his wife. "He'll be gone by the morning."
"Venison stew," Mrs. Karina announced, placing an enormous pot upon the table. "It was going to last me all week. I hope there's enough to go round. You all like venison, I trust. I can always rustle up something else if not. What about the Grochucan gentleman? Is he eating with the rest of you? Do they eat venison, the Grochucans, I wonder?"
"He'll eat what he's given and count himself lucky,"
the General said. "It sounds lovely," Mr. Barracus said. "Your good husband has told me all about your cooking, Mrs. Karina. I have high expectations."
"I shan't tell you again," the General said with a glare. "One more word out of you and you'll be down in the cellar with a hunk of dry bread."
"Well, please now, will someone tell me what is going on?" Mrs. Karina said, beginning to ladle out the stew. "What are you all doing here? Why have you come back home again? And why have you brought a Grochucan with you?"
"It's a long old story, my darling," Mr. Algothian explained. "But the bare bones of it is that we all escaped from Grucan Gogor. 12 of us there were to start with, all prisoners, apart from him over there. He's a spy, you know. But 2 poor chaps lost their lives along the way, 3 have gone missing, and we 6 are what's left."
At that very moment there was a ring at the door, followed as before by the excited barking of the dogs. Mr. Algothian rose up and disappeared into the hall, but I could overhear his cheerful voice as he greeted someone heartily. "Well, I never!" he exclaimed. "We were just talking about you. I thought you were lost to us. Come on in, come on in." Into the room came a familiar figure with a beaming grin upon his face.
"Didn't think you could get rid of me that easily, did you?" our friend Mr. Quilk said. "And it looks like I've arrived just in time for some grub."
A second figure appeared, very tall and carrying a javelin.
"Picked up a friend along the way too," Mr. Quilk smiled. "Good old Raven Salvastro." "It's grand to see you alive and well, Quilk," Mr. McFiber said. "Whatever happened to you?"
"Fell into the enemy's hands again," Mr. Quilk explained, "while I was out with Ramcarn.
You'd have thought they'd have learnt by now, though, that you can't keep a magpie under lock and key. I make that 5 successful getaways all told. That's a pretty impressive tally, don't you think? Mind you, it was all Mr. Salvastro's doing this time."
"Happened to be passing by,"
Mr. Salvastro said.
"Couldn't leave an old friend in the broth. See, you've got the old snake at last. Well caught, friends."
"What about Ramcarn?" Mr. Algothian asked. "Where's he?"
"Afraid he got collared," Mr. Quilk told us. "We saw him later on under heavy armed guard along with Mr. Gevins. Still, 7 out of 12 isn't too bad, I suppose. That's more than half of us back safe and sound. Oh, venison stew, is it, Mrs. Algothian? Mind if I pull up a chair?"
"By all means, my good sir, by all means," Mrs. Karina replied, hurriedly grabbing an extra 2 bowls. "What a merry gathering this is turning out to be! Do eat up, gentlemen. Don't let it go cold. You've all had quite an exhausting time of it, by all accounts. Do tuck in."
"So how did you know we'd be here?" Mr. McFiber asked. "Followed your tracks, didn't we?" Mr. Quilk said. "Well, Salvastro did most of the work, if I'm honest. Hold up, is there meant to be a snake under this table?" "Oh, don't mind him," Mr. Algothian said, reaching down and retrieving a bright green serpent. "He's perfectly harmless. You shouldn't be in here, though, Arrow, should you?"
"What will you do with Barracus?"
Mr. Salvastro asked.
"Best watch him like a hawk. Slippery chap, isn't he?"
"That's a little pejorative, don't you think?" Mr. Barracus protested. "You could be called pretty slippery yourself, making yourself out to be a guard there in Ulcus."
"We'll be taking him to Barrack Dean," the General said. "First thing tomorrow."
Could save you the journey, Mr. Salvastro offered. Due there myself. Need fresh orders. Quill can come with me.
That's very decent of you, Mr. Salvastro, the General replied. I must say it would be rather nice to spend a night or two back at the estate, and I'd be quite glad to get this scoundrel off my hands.
We'll go tonight, Mr. Salvastro said. The sooner he's safely locked away, the better.
We'll have pudding first, though, won't we? Mr. Quilk said hopefully, as he wolfed down the stew very speedily.
It's Toffee's sponge, Mrs. Carina informed us. Your favourite, my dear. You picked the right day to come by, you did. Anyone for seconds of stew first? There's still a bit left in the pot. I hope you've all had enough. I'd have made plenty more if I'd known you were all coming.
It's lovely, Mr. Argothian said, with a reassuring touch on her arm. And there's more than sufficient, my dear, as there always is.
It's frightfully good, Professor Jaggles agreed. Magnificent.
The toffee sponge which followed certainly lived up to expectations. It was quite possibly the most scrumptious and Moorish dessert I had ever tasted. 6 very satisfied travellers went to bed that night. Our stomachs were full, our beds warm and snug, and we were in our beloved homeland. The only drawback was the noise. There was rather a lot of hooting, howling, hollering and honking through the night, coming from all directions, so it took me quite a while finally to fall asleep. As I was trying to drift off, I thought about Mr. Quilk and Mr. Salvastro, trekking through the night with Mr. Barracus. I kept thinking about the final words he spoke to us before he was taken away. This won't be the last you see of me, my friends. I very much hoped he was mistaken. I'd be happy never to set eyes on him again. I also thought of what lay ahead, the final leg of our journey. All being well, we'd reach Rowandale by the next evening. I could hardly wait. After so much weary travelling, I'd finally set eyes on Amarella. The heartiest of cooked breakfast was waiting for us in the morning. 6 massive plates were piled high with bacon, sausages, mushrooms, eggs, tomatoes and crunchy golden brown things that I couldn't quite identify. You've got to keep your strength up, Mrs. Carina said as she poured out the tea. We can't have you collapsing on your final stretch now, can we? Eat up, gentlemen. There's plenty more of everything out in the larder.
If I have all of this, I shall burst, Professor Jaggles said, looking at his overflowing plate. Do you always dine as heartily as this, Mr. Argothian?
We've landed on my feet, and no mistake with my darling Carina, he beamed in reply, with an affectionate glance towards his wife. You should see what she brings out for the winter feast, mind. You could feed a herd of elephants with what's laid out on this here table. Talking of which, General.
Yes, what is it?
The General asked. Permission to stay here for a day or two, sir, Mr. Argothian requested. You shan't be needing me down in Rowandale, I dare say, so I was wondering if I might have a few days' leave, sir.
But of course, my good man,
the General smiled, slapping Argothian cheerfully on the back.
Wouldn't dream of whisking you away from your beloved so soon. My plan is to report back to the Queen the day after the feast. You can meet us there in Barrack-Dean.
And what about you, Professor? Mr. Slank asked. Will you be coming with us to Rowandale?
Yes, I'll tag along with you if you'll have me, Professor Jaggles answered. I haven't really got a settled home as such, not in the conventional sense at any rate.
Grand, Mr. McFiber said. Then we can all have the feast together at the Silver Centaur. A merry celebration before we all head back to war.
I can't wait, the General said. We'll make it a feast to remember.
Having said our farewells to Mr. Argothian and Mrs. Carina, we set out with a fresh lightness in our spirits and journeyed on southwards. Snow was now falling steadily, and the trees around us looked magically beautiful as the sparkling whiteness glistened on their branches. The horrors of the war and the trials of the last few months suddenly seemed 100 miles away. And then, in the mid-afternoon, a familiar sound came reverberating through the forest, and all of a sudden, out of the trees came a sight that made my heart dance excitedly inside me. It was Thunderbolt, my faithful retriever, charging out to greet me. How he leapt and wagged his tail and licked me all over to show his delight at finding me. It was wonderful to see him again, and it meant that Rowandale couldn't be all that far away. My thoughts ran to Amarella and the prospect of seeing her again very soon. I wondered what I would say to her. There was so much to tell her, of course. I'd had so many exciting adventures.
I wanted to tell her about fighting the pirates and encountering the Hesperike and the escape from the palace of the Truk. But I didn't want to blabber on and make a fool of myself by talking too much. Nor did I want to be all silent and awkward and end up saying hardly anything at all, like so often in the past. And how would I ever get the conversation round to what I really wanted to say to her? Would I actually be able to summon up the courage to tell her how I truly felt? I began to feel quite nervous and uneasy. We made reasonable progress through the rest of the afternoon, and the snow became heavier and heavier. We didn't talk very much, and we only stopped once to have a quick snack and to give the horses a rest. Thunderbolt was leading the way, bounding forward with oodles of energy and irrepressible glee. Soon there came some familiar sights. We rode down Strawberry Lane, where I'd so often picked basketfuls of delicious fruit on a bright summer's day. We came to Mrs. Melderelder's Rainbow Fields, where neat rows of brightly coloured flowers were in bloom all year round. We passed Shepherd Hibden's flocks as they grazed silently in the meadows. And then, as the sky began to darken, we trotted over one more hill, and there it was. Oh, what a joyous sight to take in! The little rows of thatched cottages with their smoking chimneys, the brightly lit streets all covered in a blanket of snow, the great stone watchtower with its chiming bell, the quaint little shops that line Chestnut Avenue, and there in the middle of the village, glistening white, with its cheery sign swaying gently in the breeze, the Silver Centaur. I was home at last.
We made our way eagerly down into the village, and as we dismounted from our horses, various astonished residents came peering out their houses to have a look at us. How good it was to see their familiar faces! Mrs. Melderelder, and old Meviticus, and Dr. Fripple, and Rowandale the cook, and then my heart skipped a beat, my breath stopped in my mouth, my stomach started dancing with butterflies. It was Amarella. Oh, how preposterously beautiful she looked, as she stood there in the doorway of the Centaur, dressed in a soft blue frock that perfectly matched the colour of her eyes, her golden hair speckled with tiny flakes of snow, her smile shining out with a radiance that I found overpowering. Everything around her looked dull and dim by comparison. I was as helplessly under her thrall as ever before. Resistance was useless. She had me unalterably spellbound by her charms. Oh, how I ached to tell her all that was in my heart, and win her as my beloved, my sweetheart, my bride. Before I had the chance to go up and speak to her, the loud, penetrating voice of Mrs. Melderelder came booming through the air.
"Welcome home, gallant heroes," she said. "How glorious to see you all with life and health and strength. 3 cheers for our noble fighting men."
The crowd erupted into enthusiastic shouts of welcome and acclaim, and dozens of arms were thrust out towards us to clasp our hands in greeting.
"What brings you home?"
Dr. Fripple asked, as the noise began to subside.
"We were taken prisoner," the General explained, "but we broke free and have journeyed back through many dangers. We shall stay here for the festivities and tell you all about it."
"It's so good to see you again,"
said a voice at my side.
"What a lovely surprise."
Oh, how marvellous it was to hear that sweet, delightful voice again, the voice of the girl I longed to have at my side for as long as I draw breath in this world. I turned and looked into those mesmerizing eyes, and every sight and sound around me faded into obscurity. "It's good to be back," I replied feebly, immediately kicking myself that I couldn't come up with anything more interesting to say. I wanted to add, "I love you, Amarella. I think you're the loveliest girl in all the 12 kingdoms, and my dearest wish in all the world is to marry you," but I thought better of it and held my tongue. "And tomorrow," she said, with a gleam in her eyes, "tomorrow we'll have the biggest, grandest, most sumptuous winter feast that Rowandale has ever seen. You've come back just in time."
"Come along, Hektus,"
the General said, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the love of my life into shadow and gloom.
"Let's go inside for a well-earned glass of honeyglug."
The 5 of us piled into the Centaur and slumped our weary bodies round a table, and Rowandale brought us all an especially large glass of the sweet, delicious, creamy speciality for which she was renowned throughout the region. I could only see Amarella at a distance now, working away in the kitchen as she tidied things up ready for the big day tomorrow. Soon she had melted away into the night with just the briefest of waves and smiles to us all as she went back out through the door.
"Well then, Slank, we'd best get back to the estate,"
the General said, slowly rising to his feet.
"What a surprise we'll give to dear Dormer! Until the morning then, dear friends."
Fatigue began to creep over me, and yawning profusely, I slowly made my way upstairs. What a sweet and pure delight to be back in my own room again. I don't think I'd ever had such a good and satisfying sleep in all my years as I did that night. A warm, cosy bed, thick, soft blankets, plush, plump pillows, familiar surroundings, a full, contented stomach, and no noisy animals disturbing the peace. Fantastic! And then, when I awoke, it would be my favourite day of the year. The village burst into a frenetic chaos of activity when morning came. Everyone was bustling about all over the place, finishing their preparations for the big night. Meat was purchased, berries were gathered, wood was cut, lanterns were put up, decorations were made, cakes were iced, buns were baked, gifts were wrapped, cards were written, flowers were picked, snow was cleared from pathways, and windows adorned with bunting and banners. It was going to be a night to remember. In the afternoon, I walked about from house to house, admiring people's decorated gardens, receiving hearty greetings, hearing the latest news, pitching in wherever I could help, and soaking up the wonderful convivial atmosphere that permeated everywhere. I couldn't wait for the celebrations to begin. As daylight began to fade, I ventured back into the Silver Centaur and flopped down on one of the sofas. I was so pleased to be back there again. It looked so warm and cosy and inviting, especially now that Rowandale had lit up the place with candles. A mighty fire was roaring away in the corner, crackling delightfully, and the whole parlour had been decorated with garlands and pine cones and berries. The General, Mr. Slank, and Professor Jaggles were relaxing on the high-backed armchairs by the fire, while Mr. McFiber was racing about from room to room, making sure everything everywhere was exactly and precisely as it should be. Amarella and Rowandale were bringing out a most spectacular spread and placing everything on a long series of tables stretched across the middle of the room. There were pies and potatoes, salmon cakes and sausages, nuts and seeds, tarts and pastries, tomatoes and cucumbers, biscuits and cheeses, oranges, grapes, melons and silver apples, all kept coming out of the kitchen with unrelenting regularity, to the point that the tables began to creak under the weight of all that delectable banquet. But the grand centrepiece was still to come. Rowandale always produced something different each year, and I was not disappointed when I saw what this year's choice was. A delicious brace of roast swan. What a glorious treat we were in for. And all the while I couldn't take my eyes off Amarella. I still couldn't quite believe that I was really seeing her again. Was I dreaming, or was she actually there before my very eyes in all her exquisite, dazzling beauty? Soon the inn started filling with a whole host of invited guests. The General's wife, Lady Dormer, was there, and 3 maids from his estate, one of whom kept looking over to Mr. Slank and trying to catch his eye. Mrs. Melderelder turned up, and Mrs. Kerin Carler, the famous singer, and old Meviticus, who was over 100. Of course, it was mostly women and older men who were present, since almost all the younger men were still away at war. By the second hour of the evening, everyone had taken their seats around the tables, and Mr. McFiber, as host, stood up to propose a toast.
"My lords, ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising a glass of honeyglug, "I count myself fortunate indeed to be back here on this night of all nights, while others of our village fight for queen and country in far-off lands. And so, my good friends, my toast tonight is to all my noble comrades far from home."
Everyone lifted their glasses in the customary fashion and thought of absent friends. Then the General stood up beside me.
"I would like, if I may," he said, "to propose an additional toast. 2 brave men lost their lives on our journey home from Golga, and I would like to pay them tribute. One was in fact a Mardurian, but a fine and exemplary man in truth. The other was a fellow Galamene, who valiantly gave his life to protect our noble queen. To Volko, son of Nolko, and Jackdaw Tando."
Everyone repeated their names and raised their glasses once again. I felt a deep pang of sadness as I remembered them, and my thoughts turned too to Mr. Ramcarn and Mr. Gevins, back in the fetters of the enemy.
"I too would like to propose a toast,"
Mrs. Melderelder said, in her usual booming voice,
"to our hero's return from the field of war, the dear General, Professor Jaggles, Mr. Slank, our honourable host, and young Hektus."
I didn't know where to look as everyone cheered us. I did, though, catch Amarella's eye, and my heart soared as I saw her smiling straight towards me.
"If there are no further toasts,"
Mr. McFiber said, returning to his feet and refilling his glass,
"then I wish you all the very happiest of nights. Let the feast begin."
As we began tucking into the gorgeous banquet laid before us, the General had kind words to say to us all.
"My dear, loyal, faithful Slank," he said first, "I've been greatly humbled, and I hope mellowed, by our experiences these last few weeks. I've been an intolerable fool at times, I freely admit, and I misjudged you dreadfully. I am heartily sorry, and I shall endeavour from now on to put past follies behind me."
"All has been forgiven, sir,"
Slank replied.
"I, on my part, have been somewhat pretentious and self-important on occasion, and for that I unreservedly apologise."
"Jaggles, McFiber, Hektus,"
the General continued,
"I know I've spoken harshly to you all at times, but it has truly been an honour to serve you as your leader. You have each proven yourselves brave, resolute, and noble. I am glad to count you among my friends."
"Why, thank you, General," the Professor said. "The feeling is mutual, I assure you. You have a host of admirable qualities, and at times I have been slow to see them. Let us leave the past in the past, and look to the future." "Hektus," said a voice behind me, the dearest voice in all the world. Amarella had finished her work in the kitchen and sat down in an empty seat beside me. A nervous excitement rose up in my stomach. "I've barely spoken to you since you got back," she said, smiling sweetly. "You must have so many stories to tell. We've been worried sick about you all here. I can't believe you met Prince Vorkrond, and you caught a Groojukan spy, Mr. McFiber says. You're a hero, Hektus." My tongue froze in my mouth as she overpowered me with her enchanting loveliness, and I could barely get any words out. I swallowed nervously and stammered out, "Yes, it's been ever so exciting, Amarella. You wouldn't believe half the things I've seen." "You must tell me all about it," she said. "You had a close encounter with a giant as well, I hear. That must have been so terrifying. I'm so glad you all made it back in one piece." As I sat there, intoxicated by the sunshine of her presence, and enveloped in the beguiling music of her voice, I renewed the resolve I had made upon entering Gallimenia. I was going to ask her my question that very night. I'd always planned to propose to her down by the sea, by the ruins of a castle near Holberdine, but I couldn't endure the agony any longer of not knowing whether she'd be mine. Tonight would be the night. Nothing would stop me. Following the feast, there was music, dancing, a couple of games, a performance from Mrs. Kerin-Carla, and an abbreviated account of our adventures from General Montegolin. Throughout it all, Amarella was sitting right next to me, enrapturing me with her every laugh, her every smile, her every glance towards me. And then, just as old Maviticus got up to play us a tune on his fiddle, there was a tremendously loud knock upon the door. Quite a number of people jumped with surprise.
"I wonder who that could be,"
Mr. McFiber muttered as he went over to the door.
"It's rather late for new guests."
I turned my head to look out into the hall and tried to make out who it was. The door creaked open, and a dark, cloaked figure stepped into the inn. He was wrapped up in thick, heavy garments, with a hood over his head and snow all over him. As he entered the parlour where everyone was gathered, an expectant hush came down upon the room. Then the mysterious visitor took off his hood and removed his cloak and fur coat, revealing a familiar, honest-looking face and a long red and yellow scarf. It was Mr. Algovian.
"I come bearing news,"
he cried out, looking as though he were trying to suppress a smile. News of great joy. News of something wonderful and magnificent. News that'll cause your soul to soar and put a song in your heart.
Well, out with it, man,
the General cried impatiently.
What is it?
Brace yourselves for an exceedingly pleasant surprise, Mr. Algothian grinned. I've hurried here all the way from Cherrygate, commandeered the post wagon, I did. I couldn't wait to let you all know. News has come to us from Barrack Dean. You'll never believe it, brothers. It's over. It's totally and utterly over. Everything's finished. The time has come at last. The war is no more. The loudest, heartiest, most exuberant cheer I'd ever heard burst out from all assembled. It was the grandest, gladdest, most glorious news we could possibly have heard. Tell us more, Professor Jaggles said when the noise had died down. What has happened? Are you absolutely sure? How did you hear? Heard it from one of the Royal Heralds, Algothian answered. They're on their way from village to village. Everything's gone wrong for the Grochukins, it seems. There was another devastating air raid on Kendham, the largest one yet. The palace itself was struck, and our armies have surged forward and got within 10 miles of the city. And the Silver Serpent's been sunk, the pride of the enemy fleet. And the deal with Macari has fallen through, and now the Emperor's last desperate hope of success, that hideous scheme of Barracus, has all come to nothing. They know they can't win now, so they've signed a deal with us. A dragon pilot brought the news to Her Majesty only this morning. It's all over, friends. Peace is restored. I'd never seen such joy and jubilation as I witnessed that wonderful night. There was laughing and hugging and shouting and singing and dancing and even a cartwheel or two. The dreadful threat hanging over us was gone. Our friends and comrades would be able to come home. We would no longer have to go back into the Empire and fight our deadly foe. I could stay here in Rowandale and never have to leave my beautiful homeland again. It was the perfect end to a perfect day. Our troubles were over, our sorrows were ended, our lives were restored. Peace had returned to Ganvor. To celebrate these fabulous tidings, Mrs. Melderelder and Professor Jaggles arranged for an impressive display of fireworks to be set off on the village green. We all trudged out into the thick, crunchy snow and settled down on blankets, cloaks and rugs. The fireworks were spectacular. So many colours, so many shapes, so many formations. I half suspected that the Professor had secretly used some halverandy to achieve such results. There was enthusiastic applause from all the village. I doubted there would ever be a more perfect moment to pose the question that was burning in my heart. It was now or never. I was going to ask Amarella to marry me, and no force in Ganvor could stop me. I rose to my feet, my heart racing like a charging cheetah, took the very deepest of breaths, and strode forward. "Wonderful, aren't they?" I said nervously, walking up beside her. "The best display I've ever seen," she returned. "Absolutely stunning." "Not half as stunning as you," I wanted to say, but thought better of it. "Quite," I said, swallowing hard. "It's been so lovely to see you again, Amarella." Amarella smiled, a smile that melted my entire being into a helpless mush of yearning and longing, and that seemed to make time itself stand still. "I missed you a lot," I added, looking down to the ground. "We all missed you too," she said. "The inn seemed so bare and lifeless without you and Mr. McFiber." "We all missed you." I wished she said I missed you instead. Why did she say we? Doubt began to tear me up inside. Was I making a terrible mistake? Was I about to make a complete fool of myself? But I had to persevere. I would explode if I didn't unburden myself of the question I'd been aching to ask. There was an awkward pause. My heart thumped away ferociously. "Actually, there was something I wanted to ask you, Amarella," I continued. "Oh, yes?" she said invitingly, her eyes fixed intently upon me. And then I blurted out something like the following. "Well, Amarella, I was wondering, that is to say, I've been pondering this for quite some time, and I really don't know how to put it. Well, if I'm completely honest, Amarella, I have to admit that, if truth be told, well, I can't believe I'm actually finally saying this, but the long and the short of it is that over the past years I've known you, Amarella, I've come to... what's the best way of putting it?
Well, I suppose I ought to just say it as it is. I've come, Amarella, to like and admire and delight in you more than words can ever express. You're the girl of my dreams, Amarella. You're the most beautiful, wonderful, lovely woman in all Ganvor, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. So what I'm trying to say is this. I took another deep breath, dropped down onto one knee, and gazed up into those entrancing blue eyes. Against the backdrop of the final few fireworks lighting up the night sky, I burst out with those long-rehearsed words. Blackbird Amarella, will you marry me? There. I had finally said it. I had got it out of my mouth. There was no going back now. I'd laid my cards on the table, revealed my heart, and told her how I really felt. Amarella knew that I loved her. And how did she respond? She neither refused me nor accepted me, which at least was better than the outright rejection I had so much dreaded. She said she needed time to think about it, which I suppose is only sensible, but she did agree to walk out with me, as Uncle Glester calls it. I'm taking her for dinner at the Oak and Thistle in Willowdale next Rose Day. I can hardly wait.
Oh, how I hope I won't make a complete hash of things and ruin whatever chance I might have with her by my hapless, blundering ways.
How long will she take to consider my question, I wonder? How long will my future lie in the balances, and I be kept in this state of agitation? But I'm trying to think positively. I've finally done what I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I've finally said what I've been meaning to say for ever such a long time now, and the sweetest girl in all the kingdoms is letting me court her, and might yet become my dear beloved wife. I may not know my future, but I've ever so much to be thankful for. I've survived such a risky and perilous adventure. I am alive and safe and well and free. I may not yet have the girl of my dreams, but hope burns brighter than ever before. And here I am, back home again, in the fairest land in all the world. I'd yearned for this moment for many long months. How often I had wondered what it would feel like for peace to reign once more in Ganvor. Again and again I tried to envisage what joy and relief it would bring. And now, all of a sudden, here it was. The grim shadow of war had at last been dispelled. And how did it feel? It was even more wonderful than I had ever imagined.